Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelsey LaFave, and welcome to the AgTech Outlook webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few technology tips to keep in mind while reviewing today's webinar. First, all attendees are muted throughout the presentation. Once in a while, it's a good idea to tap your mouse so your screen does not go to sleep during the presentation. There will be a time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Questions can be submitted at any point during the presentation. To send in your question, click on the question mark button on the right side of your screen to expand a text box where you can then type in your question. And lastly, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation materials will be available at farmcrediteast.com as well as on our YouTube channel. And now a quick disclaimer, this information is presented in good faith and is not intended for investment, tax, or legal advice. Today we have Joe Waddell from Horizon Farm Credit. He is the Industry and Innovation Officer for Horizon, and today he'll be providing an overview of the ag technology space. I will now hand it over to Joe.
Can you see my screen good?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So I think it's important to kind of set the stage when thinking about innovation and ag technology, and perspective is important. And the lens we view things through, I spend a good bit of time trying to find alternative perspectives to broaden my base of understanding. My background is in production agriculture, coming from a diversified dairy farm and then working through ag industry as a test engineer, then over to sales and marketing. That kind of really allowed me to see a broad swath of agriculture across the East Coast and the entire US and the diversified operations. Kind of helped my understanding of how unique every operation is and what's successful in one place doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. And there's rarely a silver bullet when it comes to ag tech. My focus areas are across a broad swath from regulatory policy and climate smart ag to controlled environment ag and pretty much anywhere in between. Today, we're really going to focus around biologicals and artificial intelligence's role in agriculture. So for innovation, I really like this definition, the process of creating value by applying novel solutions to meaningful problems. And really, when we think about innovation on the farm, it's not about chasing the latest piece of technology. It really starts with knowing your operation, tightening up the fundamentals, and being clear on what problems you're actually trying to solve. When those pieces are in place, precision ag and artificial intelligence can save time, reduce risk, and improve decision-making. Innovation really only matters where it creates value. And when we're talking about innovation from a farm-based perspective, you really need to talk about systems level thinking. And that's a lot of what I do. When we're talking about different technologies that might apply or different ways to improve your farm, you need to understand how one change can affect the entire system. And a lot of times, some of the folks in the industry or that are working on solutions are very laser focused in their bubble of solution and don't realize how it could impact other things around them. And the key really is, if you're going to adopt something, fail fast, learn faster, be willing to pivot if whatever you adopted didn't work on your farm when you're trying new technologies. So I pulled this picture up here that kind of talks about today and where we're at and where we want to go. And there'll be a similar theme kind of throughout today's presentation on where are we headed with ag tech and adoption and just farming in general. So, on the left side, we see the progression from farm-based thinking to field-based thinking. Then we get down into plant-based thinking. And then the latest and greatest is, what's happening in our soils. There's a lot of opportunity for tech advancement in these spaces and getting the data around the whole farm gate so we can leverage some of these tools that are available. And similarly on a cattle operation, right? You look from a whole herd perspective, you have to start there. Then you can break it down into groups. You can break it down into individual animals. And then you can break it down into what's actually happening in each of the animals to help with production or see where things are. This slide I really like to show because it's really any advancement, whether it's technology or others, kind of go through what's called the Gartner hype cycle. Everything kind of has to move through this before it shows value. And just talking through it a little bit, when something new comes out, there gets to be a lot of hype around it. And this can happen in societal trends as well. There's a lot of hype about it. It goes to the peak where it's just at a fever pitch, and this is the best thing that's come out. Well, then reality sets in, and maybe they missed a few things, or the ROI is not quite there. Things tend to slide down through the trough of disillusionment, where it's really time to regroup, refocus, figure out what your piece of technology is actually doing and how is it really working across the farm gate. And then slowly that'll kind of work its way up to products that are available in the market that are having adoption, that have an ROI, the plateau of productivity. Now, you can argue on here, I've placed a few things, but you could argue on the placement of a few of these things. And if you see, we're talking about AI today, so I wanted to put it on here. It's in two different places because there's really two different thinkings when it comes around artificial intelligence. The large language models, which are all the hype today, ChatGPTs, the Groks, the Geminis, and there's fever pitch about how they're going to solve a lot of problems. And I would say that they're getting close to the peak. And at some point, they're going to hit the trough of disillusionment and refocus and recycle and consolidate into something more solvable. And then we have the artificial intelligence, which is more on the engineering perspective from my background before, where we have computer vision, machine learning that is automating systems and robotics that is starting to see productivity already. And I think that's going to advance pretty quick. I think, the biologicals have been around for a long time. There's a lot of excitement around them currently with kind of the shift in climate smart ag and regenerative practices. And if you want to call it, sustainability as a whole on the farm gate, how are we leveraging everything that comes across the farm gate to the best of its abilities? I would say it's still on the rise. There's a lot of questions around it, and we'll talk through some of those. An example of something that's really in the plateau of productivity would be your general basic GPS systems. There's pretty broad adoption, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of $10 solutions to $1 problems that will find that peak and have to kind of sort their way through at the end of the day. So talking through a little bit of decision making, it's kind of hard to find good polling data on what's happening on the farm. If you look at the polls out there and the folks that respond, there'll be a certain lower percentage that responds to each of the polls. So sorting through this can be interesting, but really this is a busy slide. But the key factors here are, kind of obvious, but the younger generation is who likes to adopt and try new things. We all kind of get set in our ways in our personal lives as well. And as we get older, we like to stick to the norm and not necessarily wander outside so much. But farmers are really looking for a good ROI before they're going to jump in and adopt something. Farming is a decision business under a lot of uncertainty. And at the end of the day, when we start to adopt things, iteration really beats hesitancy, so you can actually start to get somewhere. And the technology is going to win when it actually improves your decision-making quality. And I would say, artificial intelligence and biologicals we're going to talk through today both kind of function as risk management tools, and they're not silver bullets. And the other thing that this slide really speaks to, as some of the USDA data shows out, is the farm transfer of generation that's going to happen here in the next 15 years, where we're going to go from an older generation into the younger generation. It'll be very interesting to see how that affects the adoption rates and whether we kind of ramp up adoption or whether it stays very slow and steady as we're seeing. And there's not every ag tech piece out there is actually a win for the farmer. I pulled this one up here because I think it's interesting, and both these come from Bushel State of the Farm, and they've done several years in a row, so they have some trending information. Most of this is from the Midwest, but it's still, I think, valuable to look at the trends and where things are going. But if we look at a lot of today's discussions around data when we get to artificial intelligence, but how are we tracking our information? Where is it being kept? Is it still pen and paper? Have we shifted to Excel spreadsheets? A lot of folks are in the Excel spreadsheet stage, and that's fantastic because it's organized information and we can use it. But if it's still in a shoebox somewhere, it's very difficult to leverage some of these later stage tools that are going to be coming available to us. I don't know why my slides keep advancing, but they do. So it'll be interesting to see as we get there, what happens with some of these adoptions and shifts. And we're starting to see some pretty good opportunity to come out with different ag-specific accounting softwares that are starting to hit. The issue with adoption here has, again, been the industry likes to silo itself and not work well with others. So when you go down one path on your operation, it's hard to maybe shift gears if something else comes out, because the two softwares won't work with each other. That we're making pretty good progress there, but I would say there's a long way to go when it comes to that. This slide's really busy, and the point of it's not really to read the fine print. The point of it is to look at the trend in adoptions. And the upper left graph shows the guidance and auto steer kind of hit its plateau of that 70% adoption. So it's pretty well adopted. It's easy. It's out there. It's readily available. If folks want to go the auto steer guidance route, they can get it, and it's actually becoming reasonably affordable. And this is a dealer survey to note. So it's what information or technology dealers offer and support. And at the end of the day, service and support will determine if a technology is going to stick. If there's a novel technology out there, it might work really well, but if you can't get service for it, it doesn't stick. The lower graph kind of shows an interesting trend to me as we start talking going from more of the farm level agronomics to field level, and then ultimately, hopefully, getting down to plant level in the future, is variable rate technology. And you can see that it got up to upwards of 40%, and then kind of plateaued and is hanging out. And it'll be interesting because variable rate is nothing new. It's been in the market for a long time, but there's just not a lot of good support around it. And then when you look at markets and then costs of nutrients, when markets cycle up and down in the application process, especially when you have co-ops doing work, they kind of ebb in and out of the variable rate technology based on costs. So it'll be interesting to see if we start gaining some traction. And on the right-hand graph, the red, we do have some popping up for robotic and autonomous weeding, and that's happening in California, right? There is some adoption trends actually starting to come online there. It's very low, but it's a very new technology. So it'll be interesting to see how fast they really get adopted. But if you look up into the greens and the yellows, really it starts from satellite and aero imagery. We have a lot of data. We're collecting a lot of things there. Variable rate and soil sampling, row clutches and yield monitors are make the peak of the list, which makes sense. Those technologies have been out for quite some time. And I think it's important to note, biologicals are going to need similar support from a back end to actually make scale and get on the board, so to speak, when we're talking about competitiveness. So shifting into the biological discussion, and I don't expect you to be able to read this slide. That's kind of the point of it. This is the crop biostimulant landscape, which shows a broad array of everybody that's trying to play in biostimulant landscape. So nutrient uptake. It's a very interesting chart, and the company that puts this together, the Mixing Bowl, does a very good job. Every year they try to put a chart together and kind of see the consolidations and what's happening. But it really speaks to the complexity of the market and availability for the farmers. So where are we going to go? If you looked at this chart 2 years ago, it was double the size. So we're already starting to see some of the consolidation, but it's really a fast growing, highly fragmented market. There's a lot of players jumping in the game. There are some real farm wins, but the performance is very much dependent on location. Where was that farm at? What did the weather do? How are things working? And I would say from an innovation perspective, the pedals to the metal on what's happening and coming out. And it's only going to get more complex as we get more players in this game and as this market kind of develops a little bit. So talking through some of the challenges, right? The biologicals can work, but context is key. Consistency and predictability of a biological is pretty difficult. If you think about what they're doing and what they're trying to replace, it's living organisms. And they are much more susceptible to the weather that surround them, especially if you think Northeast, when we get a lot colder weather and soil temperatures. If you think of what's in the soil, they interact and have different operating parameters based around what's in the soil. So when we do see some windows where they work very well, it's not necessarily every year either. And the problem with anything when it comes to technology or nutrients or biologicals is it takes a good 10 years of data to really show the trend out and pull the anomalies from a weather pattern that changed your response versus what the biological is actually doing and what's actually happening in your soil. I would say another major issue here is product clarity. The what is in it, what it's doing, why it's doing it is kind of all over the place. You have some folks that are doing a pretty good job of trying to break down what their product actually does, and you have other folks that are just kind of throwing it to the wind and seeing what happens and selling that product as a very broad use case, not really specifying where it works and where it doesn't. These are living organisms, so the shelf life and manufacturing are an issue. And whether it's shelf life stability or whether it's, you could have a silver bullet, if you will, from a biological perspective, but if you cannot manufacture that biological in the scale needed, at the cost needed, it's never going to take off. And there's some pretty significant barriers there that they're working through on how to scale up when they do have some things that work pretty good. The other issue, especially if you talk about farmer adoption level, is compatibility. If you want a product to get adopted, it has to be able to fit in a current system and run seamlessly. If you have to add new systems to what they're doing to start running new products, it's very hard to get adoption. So there's a lot of issues with tank mixes where fertilizers and biologicals don't get along very well, which makes sense because you have a living organism and sometimes you're throwing them into a very salty environment, so that doesn't help. And then placement, where are we getting that placement and is it close enough to the seed? We talk about economics. There was a pretty strong case for some of these biologicals with some of the synthetic inputs being pretty high here the last few years, but we're starting to see some of those prices relax. And as we see those prices relax, it'll be interesting to see if the economics can keep up on the biologics or if they're going to price themselves out of the market, and seeing that return on investment every year. And then really, if you talk about, regulatory and labeling variability, some of these products, what they can be used for today versus where they want to go with them is a wholly different how they're labeled. And then if you look at the United States, what it allows versus what some foreign governments allow, like Brazil is, I would say, the Wild West. They allow biologicals pretty much all across the landscape to run, and we're a little bit more confined on what we allow to do. And that just takes a little bit of time to get through the regulatory process, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. But especially if we're talking, a biostimulant, which is nutrient uptake, versus a biopesticide, those typically have a little longer runway to get through regulatory framework to get them out and about. So there's a lot of discussion of, the biologicals coming in and just completely replacing the synthetic market. And I think this really needs to be an and, not an or discussion. The synthetics have their use case. There's a reason why we have them. I don't think they're going to go away. They might change on what we're doing and how we're prescribing them, but they really deliver that baseline control and reliability. And when you look at the biologics, they have an ability to amplify some efficiency and improve stress tolerance and really support nutrient cycling. But it's plant dependent, it's soil dependent, and it's very niche. A lot of times it's not a very broad-based application. It's a niche use case depending on your soil, what nutrients you have, and what you need help regulating to your plant and making plant available. So at the end of the day, it's going to be an and, not an or. In the future, it's going to be integration and not replacement, in my opinion. Where we're going, so it kind of circles back to what I said before, but the market's kind of big and noisy today. I think it's going to take a lot of standardization, proof, and integration before we get mass adoption from biologicals. It's going to be location dependent for sure, and it's really more of a risk management and efficiency tool in the locations that they're used. And we need better validation. There are a few companies that are doing a really good job at running scaled field trials and getting location-specific information. There are a lot of companies that are not doing much for the scaled field trials. And if you look at a lot of the companies that are trying to enter the space, they're a lot younger and not as well developed and don't necessarily have the infrastructure to get those scaled field trials out as some of the majors. But you'll notice if you follow this space pretty closely, there's been a lot of consolidation already, and I think it'll continue. But you're seeing the majors building up the Cortevas of the world, building up a biological portfolio, if you will, and they have the infrastructure to kind of really build out the regulatory framework, and then also how to get the field trials en masse to know what's really working in what place. And then also, how do you compare the biologic with the synthetic? Because they have different roles to play. And when you source them together properly, they can both kind of amplify and play off of each other. So the precise delivery we're already kind of seeing, instead of just a broad application, we need to really target these microbes and get them where they belong, so they can actually do what they're supposed to do. So a lot of seed treatment, a lot of in-furrow and targeted foliar is kind of the shift, versus just a broad-based application across the entire field. And we're starting to see, I would say, some of the early companies are starting to stay in their lane, if you will. They're really good at one thing, and they're partnering with another company that's good at another thing to bring them together for synergistic, complementary use cases. And the winners are going to be, it's kind of an obvious statement, if you will, but consistent enough, operationally easy to use, compatible with chemistries we use today, and have a clear ROI that you can explain. And whether that's monetary or whether that's a soil health improvement line, that doesn't necessarily matter. It just matters in the big picture where we're going and how it's providing value across the chain, and not being a disruptor and integrating into current systems. This last slide I want to share kind of on the landscape is the biocontrol landscape. So split apart in control versus biostimulant. And there's a lot of interesting things happening in this segment. And it delves, like I said before, a bit further into the regulatory framework, especially in certain use cases. There's a lot of work going into this, and I think there's going to be a lot of fascinating things that come out. But the reality is there's anywhere from a 2 to a 5 year regulatory hold on some of these products to get them to market. So we're just kind of starting to see some of the infancy of some of the more complex ones. Some of the less complex ones have a little bit easier pathway to regulatory approval. So it'll be interesting to see as they come out. And the same thing's going to happen here on this side. It's a highly crowded landscape. You're going to have some winners that get out and prove that they work in the market, and they're going to consolidate and continue to form up and be a complete package that might work well with a biostimulant as well. And circling back to the discussion around the dealerships and the support, distribution is key. Distribution and service and support is key to any of these things. And without that, you have a really hard time gaining traction and getting adoption rates. There's some really fascinating things happening in the bioencapsulation space, which is kind of replacing the synthetics, as far as getting your nitrogen to stay longer. And then even going into, in the animal side, they're doing some interesting things with bioencapsulation, so we can get the micronutrients to where we want them before they break down in the animal system. So those are kind of really early level, but I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things that happen here in the coming years as we get those figured out and figure out what the regulatory framework really looks like, and the availability to actually produce in mass, versus lab trial level products. So now we're going to shift over to kind of artificial intelligence and its role in agriculture. And I always pick this picture, and if you haven't figured out yet, I like big pictures. But this is just showing the broad acreage, but then a sprayer that could be targeting just weeds and not spraying broad acreage. And artificial intelligence isn't just a tool, it's really a capability, right? What's changing now is the speed, and we're moving from analytics to real-time decision-making and autonomy. And timing is everything in agriculture. So when technology acts a little bit too slowly, it actually misses the window. So I think that where we're seeing, artificial intelligence in the long term is helping to shift all these insights we've been collecting into actionable intelligence. So I think it's important, setting the stage again, when talking about artificial intelligence, there's different forms or fashions, if you will. Most of the hype in the news today is around large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, Gemini, whatever your phone or favorite device is based on, there is a large language model of some sort. And that's kind of what's in the news. And if you're on Facebook and watching all the pictures getting created, that's a large language model on the back end that focuses in illustration creation. But really, what is a large language model? They're just a function of their data. They're a big Rolodex of information. And not all models are created equal, that's for sure. It depends on what they're trained upon and then what their protocol is for return. But if you want to break it down in the most simplest form, the early large language models are pattern recognition. So if you think of autocomplete on your text, love it or hate it, where it kind of knows the next thing you're going to say or want to know. As you work with these models, or you're working through seeing if it's something for you, and you start to talk through the differentiators, it comes up to show that there's a lot of differentiation from model to model and what the response is going to be and how that works. And we're seeing that as you train these models, it depends on what you want to get out of them. And as you use them, it'll learn what information you're interested in and start getting you better and better information. Early on, the models were generalists. They were trained on everything that was maybe publicly available information. And we're shifting more towards the specialist model, or a mixture of experts, which is when you query a model about a question, maybe it's a math question, instead of just being the general large language model, it'll jump to a math model that does a better job at answering the specific question. If you ask an ag question, it'll jump to a model that has been better trained in ag answers to get the right answer. So now we're using and leveraging all of the intelligence out there to bring us more specific answers. And the power is in the prompt. If you ask something very broad, you're going to get a very broad answer. You have to be specific and tell it what you want it to bring back. So if you tell the model, if you're in, for instance, my field of expertise, you tell the model to act as something similar that you're doing, and then query it on a question, it'll give you the response that makes a lot more sense to your knowledge level than just a general high-level information. The other side of this, or the other aspect of artificial intelligence that a lot of people kind of get mixed up or aren't talking about, is the machine learning and computer vision side. So that's kind of been going on in the engineering realm for quite some time. It's a lot of stuff that I worked with 10 years ago that we're starting to see come out. And we can do image recognition. We can identify crop stresses. We can classify different weeds. We can count livestock. If you look at complete automation and you look at, say, Tesla's full self-drive, they're using image recognition machine learning to program their system so that it can drive and not run into things. And we'll see that from an autonomy standpoint as well, when we shift from large scale ag from just GPS to full autonomy. And it really helps with the real-time decision making and iterating in the loop. So the question is, why now? Why in the last year have we seen so much advancements and noise in the space of artificial intelligence? Well, data quality is the limiting factor. It's not compute power. Realistically, since the 80s, they've had large language models in university scale. But those models were only available because of the computers that they had available to them that weren't available in our pockets. If you look today, we have a cell phone in our pocket it's stronger than the computers that most of us grew up with, and it's just getting better. So the compute power has allowed these large language models to kind of enter the equation, right? And going forward, data is going to be key. So earlier talking about trends in adoption of Excel spreadsheets or data management, I think going forward key, if you've got to have clean quality data. I like this little quote that I have down here, data is the new oil. It's valuable, but if unrefined, it really can't be used. So garbage in, garbage out. And early on, and I say early, 6 months ago in large language models, I would say there was a lot of garbage in, garbage out because of some of the training information and how far along they were with making sure that it was spitting out validated responses. And really, when we talk, broader role in agriculture, artificial intelligence isn't going to solve bad data or unclear goals. It's just going to expose them. So it's another tool in our toolbox. But if we think about advanced decision making, ag's been collecting a lot of information for a long time. We haven't been doing a lot with that information. And one thing with artificial intelligence is it does allow a broad understanding of vast amounts of information. So if we can get that information into something that we know is quantifiable, and then we can feed it into different systems, we can work with weather, soil, and crop health information to really provide us a lot better insights for optimizing our operations, and play around with different variables. From the automated machinery standpoint, it's just going to continue to go up with robotics and field level GPS. And then if you look at combines of today, if you buy a new combine, the internal system is automated, and that's done by combining computer vision and making decisions based on what kind of samples they're seeing and making adjustments. So it's just going to get more complex from here and help continue to add value to that operator, or make an operator, I would say, it doesn't have to be as qualified of an individual to still get a good result out of a machine. And then circling back to kind of the opening comments about farm level farming versus field level farming down to plant level, ultimately, with all this data, we have to be able to analyze it. And this is something that's going to be able to unlock some of this for us. And at the end of the day, the goal would be able to get the digital twins, which is a pretty far way out for agriculture, but we're making some pretty good progress there. And I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a little bit. We talk about livestock management. There's a lot of really interesting things coming up using computer vision to analyze animal health. So they're training algorithms to watch feed intakes for dairy cattle, what their watch lie times. If you look at calves, tying accelerometers to calves and tying that accelerometer information to video information to talk about animal health. And they're picking up trends in animal sickness 3 and 4 days before people can. So it's really just getting ahead of the curve on some of those things and gathering it up. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting things pop out with livestock management from afar, especially using computer vision and then training upon different algorithms. And then we talk about supply chain management, really analyzing trends and even simple things from getting feed shipped to where it needs to be when a full truck. There's a lot of analytics happening on the back end, which are just going to optimize and make more efficient for moving product around. And then really at the end of the day, if you want to boil it down to what it's really helping with, is a research tool and time compression and research and development. One of the major things that's going to come out of all this is the innovation cycles are going to go from 10, 15-year cycles down to 2-3 year cycles, depending on what we're working in. And I would even argue probably a bit quicker than that once we get up to speed. So it's going to be really interesting to see how fast we can start to innovate with leveraging some of this data analysis on the back end. And then talking through kind of some more specific large language model use cases. The power is in the information that you put into the model. Very broad models are going to give you more broad answers. But if you're a Bayer or a Bex or a Syngenta, Winfield, you have a robust bank of data that you can use. So what's happening is folks are starting to build out, I would say, private language models. So they're behind closed doors, if you will, but they're entering their own information in there so that their employees, their scientists, have a Rolodex of all the information, all the field trials that they've done. So when they're trying to work or design something new, they can pull from all that experience that they've had before. And the other thing, if you think about it, is if you look at knowledge loss when you have folks retire out, a lot of times you lose a lot of that intricate knowledge. Well, if we can get it captured and put it into a large language model, the younger folks coming on board can get up to speed a lot quicker with what information is actually available for them. I think it's really important here, and I should have mentioned it before, but to stop and understand that in large language models and whatever you're using, if you're using them, make sure you understand the privacy of your information. If you're going to use anything personal information, understand what you're putting in there and where it's going. And if you're wanting to leverage some of the power of these models, it's a really good idea to buy a private subscription so that you can keep your information to yourself and it's not shared out to the broader use cases. Because a lot of these models are leveraging any user inputs to further train and refine the tools. CNH, has kind of leverage, and I know there's an external company working on this too. When you talk about equipment repair and you talk about loss of knowledge and then just the vast amount of knowledge when techs are going out to try to solve a problem in a timely fashion. Well, they're starting to build databases so that techs can search the database when they go out to a piece of equipment. If they've seen that issue before, it'll really pull it back and tell them, hey, here, 1, 2, 3 things that probably are what it should be, as well as just putting a service manual and your operator's manual in some of these things that allows it to be much more readily searchable than they have been before. Corteva is doing some really interesting things with protein modeling, and this is getting deep into the science, but finding different modes of action, so novel modes of action, so we can get our synthetics and our biologics to work better in the field. And they've had some early success, and a lot of this comes really from the pharma industry and kind of shifting over and borrowing it into the agriculture. But there's some really interesting things going on there, and they're not the only one doing it, but I just one that have talked about it before. And then shifting down from the farmer perspective, really it's a research assistant. If you're going to put your private data in there, make sure you have an enterprise model, and they are getting much cheaper than they were before. And then some fleet plant management tools. And 6 months ago, I really would have told you that it's going to be a while until the farmer level can leverage some of these tools to build out their own private farm model, if you will. But in the last month or two, there has been a plethora of advancement to where you can leverage a ChatGPT and a Claude, which does a lot of coding, to build you out a user interface, a graphic user interface for your Excel spreadsheet. You can build API connections. You can go out and scrape the internet for all the local bases on the elevators around you and have it automatically update. And that's becoming much easier for folks that aren't from the coding background to do, because you can actually leverage several different models to build out your own private database and use case. Now, I think we're probably a year or so away before that comes really easy. But if you are familiar with some of them, it's pretty reasonable to go in if you have a good idea of your information and build yourself a private language model to work on a certain topic that you're interested in, to really delve into the details. And especially if you can input some of your own information in there, or say, recommended spray rates and such things like that. That is a baseline data document that it's pulling from. I wanted to pull in and show this because I think it's interesting. I just kind of live and breathe the space, so I've been following how many different large language models are out there, and this is just a snippet. But the point of this model is it's kind of a competition, if you will, where they're asked the model agricultural questions that have a solid answer, basically a multiple choice, where there is a right answer, and then they just circle through and see how often that model actually gets ag right. And so even the highest return rates are getting 93, 94%, right? And I pulled a snippet down to that 87%. So the question is, how much can you trust the information that's coming out on a purely a large language model around agriculture? And I say we've got a long ways to go, but it's advancing quickly. And the other thing to remember is people aren't perfect either. So it's hard to grasp the vast quantity of information that some folks have at their fingertips. And leveraging a large language model as your co-pilot, and it's not autopilot, it's not the answer, but it's how do you pull from the vast amount of information and leverage that when you're trying to work through a problem when it relates to ag or agronomy. There's starting to be some pretty powerful ag trained models, and I think that those are going to progress pretty rapidly. But the problem in lies that ag is very location specific. So going back to my learnings of traveling around, and you can do something different at the neighboring farm that might work for them, but not for you. The same is when you start asking complex agricultural questions. It really needs to know what's happening on site to get a good response back that's relatable to you, depending on context and what's happening. So it'll be interesting to see how they try to navigate what's happening there. And then if the majors do allow for integration into their models so that we can have a broad use case where you can build out a custom model, but it can also pull from a Bayer or Corteva on seed selection for your farm, based on your soil types, based on your cropping plan. And then shifting over to more of the machine learning use cases, and something that is going to be an industry disruptor and is already starting to show a little bit, is the see and spray systems. When we're talking 50 to 70% reduction in chemical use, that's a win for everybody, whether it's from a talking point standpoint to whether it's a cost saving standpoint. And the being able to use targeted treatments for resistant weeds, it's very interesting what's happening in this space. Now, it's a very new and novel technology, so it's quite expensive up front, but it's already proving to be quite valuable. And as we have a lot of fast followers, that will be add-on equipment that you can put on some older pieces of equipment, I think you're going to see broader use case opportunities. It's kind of a change of practice. There are some big question marks on how do you solve some of the issues around using these systems. As simple example would be, how do you know how much chem to mix when you're going out and spot spraying a field? You don't want to end up coming back with a tank load. What do you do with that, right? So there's some issues around that and how you're going to leverage that and solve that. And then if you think about it from an industry perspective, it's kind of a big disruptor. Ordering chemicals on a yearly basis, known on how many acres you usually spray and what the spray rate is much simpler than trying to figure out how much chem you need with a see and spray system where you're not consistently broadcasting everything. And then the other thing you have to think about there is that's pulling out of the pocket, if you will. So yes, I might be saving on chemical on my end because I don't have to purchase it. But long term, what are these chemical suppliers going to do? If they lose 50% of their chemical volume because we have broad adoption of a see and spray type system, how are they going to combat that? And I don't know the answer to that, but my guess is they'll move to something similar to when we look at seed corn, and you're going to pay for tech, you're going to pay for traits. There's some interesting stuff too that's kind of enabling the drones to get more out of fungicide and into spot spraying, with being able to fly over and create a prescription map. That's not necessarily new technology, but enables them to operate a little bit more. The drones have their own kind of unique issues, and that's a whole nother discussion, but per label and what we can spray and what we can't spray. And I just wanted to show a few different use cases as well outside of the see and spray system. So I think that it's going to definitely be influence in how we farm, and when we talk about getting down to plant level farming. And the spraying portion, one more note to make about the spraying portion of that, is just one portion. We're going through the fields with cameras, taking pictures, figuring out where the weeds are. That's also giving us a plethora of information and intelligence on plant health and anything else you can imagine in that field. So how are we going to start to leverage that for broader applications? And the successful see and spray locations that I know of have to have a change management practice, because you're still going to have your broadcast spray. See and spray isn't the solve all end all, but it has its use cases. So how you're going to have a rig that can do both, or there are companies working on combined rigs out there, so you can handle it both with one machine. So there's some interesting use cases outside of spray with that technology, and I think we're going to continue to see that gain. And then if you look at some other real world use cases that I think are pretty interesting, just looking at real-time loss counts. From my engineering perspective and understanding loss monitors and how we're used to counting things coming out of the back of a combine with pressure plates and soybeans bouncing, to now we can actually take a picture and count how many seeds are coming out. So then we know real-time loss. And then if you look at the front of the machine, historically, from a combine perspective, you're not counting loss coming off the head because the machine isn't capturing that. Well, now we have the availability to take an image, count seeds, and real-time change how we're operating our header so that we're not losing crop and we're actually getting it into the machine. I think that's a fascinating use case that has some potential to give an ROI early on. Just going back to disease detection and field analytics, I think there's a lot more we can do with more in-depth pictures, especially when we talk about disease. We talk about prevention, especially in fungal applications. and a few others that are really, into the specialty market. The Bloomfield Robotics and Vivid Machines are doing some really fascinating work in vineyards and orchards, where they're going in and being able to give yield counts because they can count the fruit, where they're going in and being able to give prescription thinning adjustments, and having that knowledge ahead of time and being much more precise than it was before gives us a lot better information. So I think that we'll continue to see advancements with the machine learning and computer vision, and being broadly adopted across different ag applications. And the other thing is, from my perspective, it allows us to, as we have labor challenges in the market, it allows us to let a novice operator operate much more effectively, especially if you look at, combines with automation, where they're getting a better result than some guys that have been running combines for 20 years, because it's always watching sample. Whereas as you fatigue throughout the day, you don't tend to change as much. And then the other thing it allows, especially as we have second and third companies come on that aren't the majors that offer an aftermarket solution, is we can keep our old equipment longer. We don't have to go buy the new $500,000 sprayer. We can put $70,000 worth of tech on it, $100,000 worth of tech on it, and run it for another 10 years. So I think it's going to open the door to a lot of opportunities outside of just having the technology there, but allowing us to keep some of our equipment a little bit longer. And then finally, kind of what I want to talk about is the, digital twins. This is kind of the end all be all for what are we doing with all this data, and how can we get here to where we are plant level farming and we can use simulation to reduce risks before the dollars are spent. That's ideally the goal. Digital twins are a long ways off, because we are simulating everything that happens on the farm gate. And when I put my test engineer hat on and go, how are we going to sample everything and get that simulation to where it needs to be? It's a daunting task depending on the farm. But what's going to happen here is we're going to start very large scale. It'll be wide operating, and then we'll slowly creep in to get further and further down the detail. And then if you think about it, I think the number usually gets tossed around is, the average farmer has, 40 crops to plant. So he has 40 times to iterate on his nutrient management plan to get it right, if you will. And then, obviously we can't control the weather, so there's a lot of variability in there. But if we can get to where we can double that, triple that, or narrow the target, it's not going to be perfect, but if we can narrow the target window so we're picking the right seeds for the soil types that we have, and making sure, maybe it's an old gen tech, it doesn't have to be new, but getting the best return on investment, dollars per acre, not necessarily bushels per acre, on what we're getting out of our property. I think that, the dairy industry is a little bit further along in some of this because they collect so much information. So it'll be interesting to see, as we get closer to these digital twins really becoming reality, what breaks out and how we can further advance, agriculture as a whole. So really with that, the biggest returns do come from compounding understanding, and agriculture has always been about adapting to change. And I think those that plant the seed of understanding today will harvest the benefits of tomorrow. I think biologicals and AI aren't quick wins. I think they're long-term capability builders, and you should probably frame them more as risk management and efficiency tools, not magic bullet solutions. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that might have arisen.
Great, thank you, Joe. We do have a couple of questions. So first, any insight or guidance on making the decision to implement a new technology? Like, I'm sure you showed that biologicals side with all the different companies. Anything there?
Is it from a broad perspective? I think it's important to start simple and understand your operation and what your goals are. So if you understand your per acre costs today, it's a lot easier to implement some of these solutions. If you're not really sure what it's costing you per acre to do something today, it's hard to pick the right technology, because you don't know whether the weather was the win and you had good weather that year, or whether it was really that technology piece. So I think back to basics is where we like to start on our home farm too, is understanding what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then iterating off of that. And then I would leverage, if you're talking about biologics specifically and how to start implementing some of those, I would leverage the company's field trial that's publicly available if you can find it. There are a few that do have really good field trials out there that they're posting. But one thing to note is, where was that trial done? A lot of these technology pieces in general are built and developed around the Midwest because that's the broadest market. And then the specialized pieces happen on the West Coast because it's a lot of the specialty market. There's a lot more money there. And then when you look at, breaking it down to the East Coast where we really sit, some of these things didn't get trialed very well in our soil types and our environment, especially when it comes to cold weather. So make sure there's some understanding of what would happen in your area. And then the other thing is, a lot of these newer stage companies will work with you a little bit if you talk to the right person on getting some trials and starting small and seeing if you really understand what impact it has for you.
Great, thanks. Another one with tighter margins. What's the trade-off for adding another new input cost, like a new technology?
Right. I think with the tighter margins, you actually see kind of the opposite of that. I mean, there's been some trending there where we see with tighter margins, folks are kind of chopping off a few of the extracurriculars, if you will, that aren't making the cut anymore. And that really comes down to really understanding what your unit metrics are on your operation, whether that's dairy or cash crop or whatever it may be. You have to understand unit metrics so that when something meets the barrier and when something doesn't. And that was kind of my comment earlier. In the last couple of years, with the synthetics really going high, it allowed some of these biologics to get in a little bit. But after several years of running, maybe they're not seeing quite the response they want or something similar. Some of them are getting cut back out of the program, or it's showing that we don't need as much synthetic. We can cut some synthetic back and pair it with a biologic and still get the same result. But is that unit value a gain for me or not? And it's not about yield. It's about cost per acre and what you're getting out of that on the back end, or the unit metrics of what are you getting for milk production and components, from a cattle perspective or from a beef perspective, how much weight are we putting on with what we're adding or taking out of our program.
Okay, great, thanks. Another one, any more information on adapting a new technology for a small operation versus a large one?
Yeah, I think that it's a slide I didn't have in here, but I have a slide I talk about. I think there's some opportunity for some smallholders to get into some new pieces of tech a little bit easier than some bigger folks. There's a lot of software as a solution types of tech, and a lot of it's just digital tracking, if you will, but it's a pay as you go, and it's a pretty cheap entry rate depending on what you're trying to get into. I think the number one thing folks should be focused on is not chasing shiny objects, but looking internally at their operations, how they can change systems to be more efficient. So if you have a good systems tracking software today, great. If you don't, and there's frankly not a lot of great ones in the ag space, try to find something that works for you where you can start tracking some of these systems to understand your metrics. Because sometimes the return on investment might be something as simple as a routine change versus buying a brand new shiny piece of tech that's going to take 10 years to pay back. And just because we like the new and shiny thing because it's fun doesn't mean that's the right way to go. And getting your data square, and it's a squeaky wheel topic for me, but getting your data square and understanding your operation is fundamental to understanding what you can adopt and if it's going to pay back for you. But I also looking at, labor reduction is always something we've always looked at heavily, is can we take somebody's routine and take 15 minutes out of their day? And how does that pay back? And it's not an easy ROI, but you can figure it out crunching some numbers.
Great. Another one, do you see any potential incentives down the road for adapting any of these new technologies?
I think that there are some incentives today already in the marketplace. If you look at, it's changed names and titles. I don't know what it's called now, but the climate smart money that was available in the prior administration, I think a lot of that money is still going to be available kind of in a different form or fashion. But if you look at, EQIP and some of the stuff you can do with REAP grants, there's some money available to try to help you get over the hurdle there per se. And I don't know what New York has, but I know Pennsylvania has some innovation grants to where you can, apply to those to get over the hurdle to get some of this technology applied on your operation. But at the end of the day, I like to say there's 98% signal or noise and 2% signal in the ag tech market. There's a lot of fluff, and there's a little bit of things that really have that immediate ROI versus a long-term payback.
Okay, it looks like we have one more question. Can you go a little further on risk management with combining multiple different technologies? I know you talked about biologicals and AI. And is there any way you can kind of combine all of these things for an overall risk management strategy?
Sure, I think, and I don't know whether I hit it on it or not, but I think one of the biggest ROIs for adopting technology or integrating new systems is that risk management piece. And how can we take, instead of the all above approach of just a synthetic or just a biological, and have the pairing come together, so when we get hit with an adverse weather event, X, Y, or Z, it kind of builds us a little bit of safety net. Circling back to your risk management, and I think leveraging some of these tools here in the next few years is going to be having all of your operational information available at a fingertip and being able to adjust and put in different, what seed do I want to use on this soil type? Do I want to use one that has a lot of traits I'm paying for, or can I get away with a generic based on what the weather forecasting is doing and what's coming into my area? So it's not speaking probably to the depth of detail that they're asking about the risk management question, but I think key as looking at technology adoption is risk management. And then a simple reducing labor and getting people out of certain situations by doing simple controls automations that's been around in outside industry for years is a wonderful way to try to adopt some risk management on your operation to automate grain bins and things like that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, so to honor everybody's time, we'll probably wrap up there. Just a reminder that Joe's presentation slides and the recording of this webinar will be available at farmcrediteast.com as well as on our YouTube page. And I think that's everything. Thank you, Joe, for taking the time to present this information for us.
Yep, feel free to reach out. My contact information is on the last slide.
Great. Thank you. Have a great day.